This is Hidden Killers Week in Review.
A look back at the most prolific stories of the week.
Four college students were dead, a killer was on the loose, and Moscow, Idaho was about to learn what it feels like when your safe little world gets turned upside down. Previously on the Idaho murders. On November 13th, 2022, Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and Zana Kernodle were stabbed to death in their off-campus house. The only witness, Dylan Mortensen, saw a figure in black leaving through the sliding glass door. A knife sheath left at the scene contained DNA that would eventually crack the case wide open. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Today we're talking about what happened next, how a college town dealt with unprecedented fear, how investigators began one of the most complex murder cases in Idaho history, and how the first clues started pointing toward a suspect who was hiding in plain sight. I'm Tony Brueski, and this is our look back on how we got here in the case against Bryan Kohberger. This is Chapter 2 in the series, A Community Under Siege. Let's start with what Moscow looked like in the days immediately following the murders, because the transformation was swift and dramatic. This wasn't a gradual change. It was like someone flipped a switch and suddenly turned a peaceful college town into a place where everyone was looking over their shoulders. According to local news reports from the week following the murders, hardware stores in Moscow saw a run on door locks, deadbolts, and security systems. Local hardware stores reported selling more locks in 3 days than they normally sold in a month. Home Depot in nearby Pullman, Washington, had similar reports. Think about that for a second. Moscow is a place where many people didn't even bother locking their doors. Students regularly left their cars unlocked, their bikes unsecured, their apartments open. The idea that you needed multiple deadbolts and a security system would have seemed paranoid just a week earlier. But 4 people were dead, and nobody knew why or who did it. Paranoid suddenly seemed reasonable. The University of Idaho's response was immediate and comprehensive. According to official university statements, President Scott Green authorized additional security measures across campus. This included increased lighting in previously dim areas, additional security patrols, and expanded hours for the campus escort service. The escort service is worth explaining for people who didn't go to college in small towns. It's basically a free service where campus security will walk with you or drive you anywhere on or near campus if you don't feel safe walking alone. Before the murders, it was used occasionally by students working late in the library or lab. After the murders, according to university reports, usage increased by over 400%. Classes were canceled for November 14th, the day after the bodies were discovered. This wasn't just about giving people time to grieve. It was about giving investigators access to campus resources and allowing the university administration time to figure out how to respond to an unprecedented situation. The university had crisis protocols, but they were designed for things like natural disasters or campus accidents. No one had planned for what to do when 4 students are murdered off campus by an unknown killer who might still be in the area. By November 15th, according to university enrollment data, approximately 25 to 40% of students had left early for Thanksgiving break. Normally, most students would stay until classes officially ended for the holiday. But normal had ceased to exist in Moscow. Parents across the country were calling their children at the University of Idaho, demanding they come home immediately. Some students wanted to stay and finish the semester, but their families weren't taking no for an answer. The exodus was so significant that local businesses reported noticeable drops in revenue almost immediately. The economic impact rippled through the entire community. Restaurants that normally thrived on student customers saw dramatic decreases in business. The bars downtown, which had been packed the weekend of the murders, were nearly empty the following weekend. Students who remained were staying home, traveling in groups, or leaving town entirely. Local apartment complexes reported an unusual number of lease terminations and requests for early moves. Some students were so spooked that they were willing to forfeit deposits and break leases just to get out of Moscow. Property managers who had never dealt with crime-related move-outs suddenly found themselves fielding panicked calls from tenants and their parents. The ripple effects extended beyond just the university community. Moscow residents who had lived there for decades were suddenly questioning their safety. Neighborhood watch groups formed spontaneously. People who had never given much thought to home security were installing motion sensor lights and doorbell cameras. According to reports from the Moscow Police Department, calls to 911 increased dramatically in the weeks following the murders. Most of these calls were reports of suspicious activity that turned out to be nothing. Delivery drivers, neighbors taking walks, normal activities that suddenly seemed threatening in the new context of fear. The psychological impact on the community cannot be overstated. According to reports from the University of Idaho's Counseling Center, demand for mental health services increased by over 300% in the 2 weeks following the murders. Students were dealing not just with grief over the loss of their peers, but with anxiety, paranoia, and a fundamental shift in their sense of safety. The Counseling Center, which normally serves students dealing with academic stress, relationship issues, and typical college problems, suddenly found itself providing trauma counseling and crisis intervention services. Additional counselors were brought in from other universities and private practices to meet the demand. Meanwhile, investigators were dealing with their own unprecedented challenges. The Moscow Police Department had never handled a quadruple homicide. According to FBI statistics, Moscow typically investigates 0 to 2 homicides per year, and those are usually domestic disputes or drug-related incidents that are solved quickly. Chief James Fry acknowledged in press conferences that his department was working with state and federal partners because they needed expertise and resources they simply didn't possess. The Idaho State Police assigned detectives with homicide experience to the case. The FBI provided behavioral analysts, digital forensic specialists, and administrative support. But even with outside help, the scope of the investigation was overwhelming. According to official statements, investigators had to process 113 pieces of physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Every item had to be cataloged, photographed, tested for DNA, and analyzed for potential relevance to the case. The 4,000-plus crime scene photographs taken by investigators illustrate the thoroughness required in a case like this. Every angle of every room, every potential piece of evidence, every blood stain and fingerprint had to be documented. This wasn't just for the current investigation. These photos would need to support prosecution efforts that might not go to trial for years. Digital evidence presented its own challenges. Investigators had to analyze phone records, social media accounts, app usage data, and location information for all 4 victims. But they also had to identify and investigate anyone who had recent contact with the victims, which meant analyzing similar data for dozens of other people. The volume of digital evidence in modern murder cases is staggering. Every text message, every social media post, every app notification, every GPS ping creates a digital record. Investigators had to sort through thousands of these records to identify anything that might be relevant to understanding the victim's final hours or identifying potential suspects. According to court documents filed later in the case, investigators executed more than 50 search warrants in the weeks following the murders. These warrants allowed them to search homes, vehicles, electronic devices, and financial records belonging to anyone who might have information relevant to the case. Each search warrant required probable cause and judicial approval. Investigators had to present evidence to judges explaining why they believed specific searches would yield information relevant to the murders. This process takes time and requires careful documentation, but it's essential for ensuring that evidence collected will be admissible in court. The FBI tip line, established immediately after the murders, was both a blessing and a burden for investigators. According to official statements, the tip line received more than 2,600 emails and 2,700 phone calls in the first month of the investigation. Every single tip had to be evaluated by investigators to determine if it contained actionable information. Most tips in cases like this are well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful. Reports of suspicious people who turn out to be delivery drivers, sightings of vehicles that don't match the timeline, theories from amateur investigators who have been following the case in the media. But buried among the thousands of unhelpful tips might be the one piece of information that breaks the case open. Investigators can't afford to ignore any of them, which means assigning personnel to follow up on every credible lead, no matter how unlikely it seems. The challenge is determining which tips are credible. Someone calling to report that their neighbor has been acting strangely might be providing crucial information, or they might be settling a personal grudge. Someone reporting a suspicious vehicle might have seen the killer's car, or they might have seen a pizza delivery driver. Investigators developed a system for triaging tips based on specificity, timing, and corroboration with known facts. Tips that provided specific information that aligned with the timeline and known evidence got priority attention. Vague reports of suspicious activity were logged, but given lower priority unless they could be corroborated with other information. The media attention complicated the investigation in ways that investigators hadn't anticipated. Major news networks descended on Moscow within days of the murders. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and other national outlets set up in the small college town, bringing satellite trucks, reporters, and camera crews. Local news stations that normally covered city council meetings and high school football games suddenly found themselves at the center of a national story. The demand for new information was constant, but investigators couldn't share details about their methods or findings without potentially compromising their case. This created tension between the public's demand for information and the investigators' need to protect their case. Press conferences became exercises in saying as little as possible, while appearing to be transparent. Chief Fry and other officials had to balance keeping the community informed with avoiding the release of information that might help the killer evade capture. Social media made the situation even more complex. Facebook groups dedicated to discussing the case sprouted up immediately, attracting thousands of members who shared theories, analyzed available information, and sometimes spread misinformation. Reddit communities dissected every piece of available evidence and developed elaborate theories about potential suspects. Some of this amateur investigation was helpful. Internet sleuths sometimes identify inconsistencies or connections that professional investigators miss, but much of it was counterproductive, spreading false information and creating additional noise that investigators had to sort through. Worse, some amateur investigators began harassing people they had identified as potential suspects based on incomplete information. Innocent people found their personal information shared online and their lives disrupted by accusations from strangers who had convinced themselves they had solved the case. Law enforcement had to issue repeated warnings asking the public not to take investigative matters into their own hands. But in the age of social media, controlling the flow of information and preventing vigilante behavior is nearly impossible. The investigation itself was following multiple tracks simultaneously. Physical evidence from the crime scene was being processed by the Idaho State Lab and other forensic facilities. Digital evidence was being analyzed by FBI specialists. Traditional detective work, interviews, timeline reconstruction, background checks continued around the clock. The knife sheath found at the crime scene remained the most promising piece of physical evidence. According to court documents filed later, Idaho State Lab forensic scientists were able to extract what they described as a single-source male DNA profile from the button snap of the sheath. This DNA analysis process takes time, especially when dealing with small amounts of genetic material. The scientists had to extract the DNA, amplify it through PCR, polymerase, chain reaction processes, and create a genetic profile that could be compared against databases. The first step was running the DNA profile through the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. CODIS contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in some states, and unsolved crime scenes. If the Moscow killer had been arrested for a felony in recent years, his DNA might be in the system. But according to later court documents, the DNA from the knife sheath did not match any profiles in CODIS. This meant the killer either had no criminal history, had never been arrested in a state that collects DNA from arrestees, or had committed crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. When CODIS searches don't produce matches, investigators have other options. They can run the DNA profile through state databases, missing persons databases, and other specialized collections. They can also use investigative genetic genealogy, a relatively new technique that compares crime scene DNA to genetic information from genealogy websites. Investigative genetic genealogy is the same technology that has been used to solve decades-old cold cases like the Golden State Killer. It works by comparing crime scene DNA to genetic profiles that people have voluntarily uploaded to genealogy websites like GED Match. When the system finds partial matches, genetic genealogists can build family trees to identify potential suspects. This process can take weeks or months depending on the quality of the DNA and the availability of relevant genetic information in the databases. But it has proven remarkably effective at identifying suspects in cases where traditional methods have failed. While DNA analysis continued, investigators were also pursuing more traditional leads. They were interviewing anyone who had recent contact with the victims, analyzing the victims' social media accounts for potential threats or concerning interactions, and trying to identify anyone who might have had a motive to harm any of the 4 students. This background investigation revealed that the victims lived relatively normal college lives. They had the typical mix of friendships, romantic relationships, academic pressures, and social activities that characterize most students' experiences. Nothing in their background suggested obvious motives for murder. The victims' families were interviewed extensively, not because they were suspected of involvement, but because investigators needed to understand the victims' relationships, routines, and any potential sources of conflict. These interviews revealed no obvious red flags or concerning relationships. Friends and romantic partners were also interviewed and, where appropriate, asked to provide DNA samples for elimination purposes. In cases like this, investigators need to identify all the DNA profiles found at the crime scene so they can distinguish between genetic material from people who belong there and genetic material from potential suspects. The house at 1122 King Road presented particular challenges for DNA analysis because 6 people lived there and guests visited regularly. Investigators found multiple DNA profiles throughout the house, but most of these belonged to residents, their friends, or other people who had legitimate reasons to be there. The DNA on the knife sheath was significant because it was found in a location where it shouldn't have been, on a piece of evidence that clearly belonged to the killer. But even that analysis required careful work to ensure that the genetic profile was complete and reliable enough to use for comparison purposes. As November turned into December, the investigation continued without any major breakthroughs. The community remained on edge, with many students still away from campus and local businesses struggling with the economic impact of the fear that gripped the town. University officials were dealing with practical challenges they had never faced before. How do you maintain normal academic operations when a significant percentage of your students have left campus? How do you plan for spring semester when you don't know if students will return? How do you reassure parents that their children will be safe? The university brought in additional security consultants to assess campus safety and recommend improvements. They increased lighting in previously dim areas, added security cameras in locations that hadn't been monitored before, and extended hours for security patrol services. But the fundamental problem remained until the killer was caught. No amount of security measures could completely eliminate the fear that had settled over Moscow. Students, parents, and community members needed answers, and investigators were working around the clock to provide them. The Thanksgiving holiday provided a brief respite from the intensity of the investigation and media attention. Many students went home to their families, giving the campus an opportunity to reset and investigators a chance to work without the constant presence of media and curious onlookers. But the holiday also meant that potential witnesses and sources of information were scattered across the country. If investigators needed to interview someone who had returned home for the holiday, they had to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in other states or wait for people to return to Moscow. The victims' families spent what should have been a joyful holiday planning funerals and trying to process unimaginable grief. Steve Gonsalves, Kaylee's father, became an increasingly public figure during this period, speaking to media and advocating for more aggressive investigation efforts. In interviews with various news outlets, Gonsalves expressed frustration with the pace of the investigation and the lack of information being shared with families. His advocacy helped keep media attention focused on the case, but it also created additional pressure on investigators who were already working under intense scrutiny. The other victims' families generally maintained lower public profiles during this period, but they were dealing with the same grief and frustration. They wanted answers about who killed their children and why, but they also understood that investigators couldn't share information that might compromise their efforts to solve the case. As December began, investigators were still processing tips, analyzing evidence, and waiting for DNA results that might provide the breakthrough they needed. The community was slowly adapting to a new reality where safety could no longer be taken for granted. Local businesses were implementing security measures they had never needed before. Restaurants and bars hired security guards for the first time. Apartment complexes installed additional lighting and security cameras. Even the local grocery stores increased their security presence during evening hours. The psychological impact on residents was evident in changing behavior patterns. People who had always walked alone at night began traveling in groups. Residents who had never locked their doors began using multiple deadbolts. Parents who had given their college-age children significant independence began checking in multiple times per day. The University Counseling Center continued to see increased demand for services. Students were dealing not just with grief over the loss of their peers, but with anxiety about their own safety and uncertainty about their future in Moscow. Some students transferred to other universities rather than return to Idaho. Others changed their living arrangements, moving from off-campus houses to dorms or apartments with better security. The sense of carefree college life that had characterized Moscow before the murders was gone, possibly forever. Meanwhile, investigators were beginning to identify patterns in the digital evidence they were analyzing. Phone records, social media activity, and app usage data were creating a detailed picture of the victims' final hours. As the investigation progressed, investigators would eventually discover evidence suggesting that someone had been watching the house on King Road. According to court documents that would be released months later, investigators would analyze cell phone tower data to identify all the phones that had been in the area around the time of the murders. This analysis would eventually reveal that one particular phone had connected to towers near the victim's house multiple times over several months, always during nighttime hours. This phone would prove to have been in the area at least 12 times between June and November 2022, according to the data. The pattern suggested surveillance rather than coincidental presence. Someone had been repeatedly visiting the area where the murders eventually occurred. But identifying suspicious phone activity and connecting it to a specific person are two different challenges. Investigators would need additional evidence to identify the owner of the phone and establish whether this surveillance activity was connected to the murders. Digital forensic specialists were also analyzing surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras around Moscow. The goal was to identify any vehicles or individuals who had been in the area during the time frame when the murders occurred. This video analysis is extraordinarily time-consuming. Investigators had to review hours of footage from multiple locations, looking for anything that seemed out of place or suspicious. Most of what they found was normal late-night activity: delivery drivers, shift workers, students traveling to and from parties. But buried in all that normal activity might be evidence of the killer's presence. A vehicle that appeared multiple times in different locations. A person walking in an area where pedestrians were unusual. Any pattern that suggested someone was surveilling the area or the victims. As 2022 came to an end, investigators had DNA evidence, digital footprints, and thousands of tips to work with. They also had a community that was demanding answers and families who were struggling with grief and frustration. The microscopic traces of genetic material on a leather knife sheath represented their best hope for identifying the killer. But the DNA analysis and comparison process was taking time. Traditional detective work had revealed no obvious suspects or motives. The digital evidence suggested surveillance activity, but connecting that activity to a specific person required additional investigation. What investigators didn't know yet was that the breakthrough they needed was coming from an unexpected source. While they were processing evidence and following leads, a routine patrol by a Washington State University police officer was about to identify a vehicle that would change everything. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, Moscow remained a community under siege, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while living with the knowledge that a killer remained at large. Students were returning from Thanksgiving break to a campus that felt fundamentally different from the one they had left just weeks earlier. The investigation was about to enter a new phase, one that would reveal just how much digital evidence we all leave behind and how advanced forensic techniques can identify suspects even when traditional methods come up short. But first, the community had to get through the remainder of the fall semester, knowing that every day that passed without an arrest was another day that the killer remained free. The victims' families continued to grieve and advocate for justice. The University of Idaho community continued to adapt to a new reality where safety was no longer assumed. And investigators continued their methodical work, processing evidence and following leads, knowing that somewhere in all the data they were analyzing was the information that would solve the case. 4 students were dead, a community was afraid, and a killer thought he had gotten away with murder. But DNA doesn't lie. Digital footprints don't disappear, and sometimes the most advanced forensic techniques can reach back in time to identify predators who thought they were too smart to get caught. The breakthrough was coming. The question was whether it would come in time to restore the community's sense of security and bring justice to 4 families who had lost everything. Next time on Bryan Kohberger, How We Got Here. The digital detective work that revealed months of surveillance, the discovery of a white Hyundai Elantra that someone desperately didn't want police to find, and the advanced genetic genealogy techniques that would eventually point investigators toward a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight just 8 miles away from the crime scene.